Well, welcome to Psychology to Live By, and today is another Q&A with some very splendid people. Our topic today is try to stop worrying about worrying. And as usual, our participants have watched the podcast of that name, and you can see or listen to it at my website, drchris.life. And I'll do a quick summary of that before we go into our actual Q&A. So why do we worry so much about worrying? The first thing is that our genetic code predisposes us to be pretty hypervigilant. In fact, evolutionary psychologists believe this negativity bias gives us a survival advantage. We overestimate danger in order to be on the safe side of things. And given we may not survive a single false positive like that snake looks cuddly, under selection pressures, the worrier genes are the ones that have been passed on to you and me. But our modern environment is so much safer than our ancestral home for which we were designed. As unfriendly as modern cities can be, apex predators are still pretty thin on the ground. So the gap between our worries and the actual danger is the greatest it has ever been. So that's half the story. What's the other half of our story? Well, we're often simultaneously aware that our worries are in fact disproportionate, that we are catastrophizing or exaggerating or being overly pessimistic or just plain illogical. So we might say to ourselves things or others, well, I know I shouldn't worry about it, but I can't help it. Or the feeling just overwhelms me. Or what's wrong with me? In other words, we then have a second problem. We now worry about our worrying. We might indeed ask ourselves, have I got some sort of anxiety disorder? Am I neurotic? So as a species, we are worrisome indeed. And one of the things we worry about is that we contradict ourselves. We're subject to the shifting of our emotional and social mentalities all the time. So we're sad and happy, afraid and peaceful, depressed and energetic, competitive and caregiving, aggressive and compassionate, often all in the same day. So these mentalities organise our minds and our bodies in ways that are usually beyond our immediate control and not of our immediate choosing. They just happen. Mostly we're not even aware of them, but simply identify and react from them. Anyway, what is one to do? The first thing we should do is accept that this is so. We accept with equanimity. Equanimity being this sort of general attitude of okayness, of accepting reality as it is. When we stop identifying with the current mentalizing, we now have a choice that was not possible before. We can draw upon our entire repertoire of selves. We can choose what appears to be the optimal state of being for this particular circumstance. What else can we do? We can cultivate other mentalities, for example, calmness or feelings of safety, curiosity and an orientation of inquiry, patience and perseverance, humour and creativity in everyday life. In the end, it's actually an empirical question. What's more constructive? What's more helpful? What's more wise? Practicing this, worrying about being a worrier might eventually become something we just don't care to worry about. All righty, so back to my good friends. Yes, worrying about worrying. I'm assuming you've all done your share of that, and I'm interested, again, in your insights and questions. I might direct who's going to answer first this time. We might start with you, Karen, just to keep everyone on their toes.
No problem. I really enjoyed listening to this podcast because I am a parent of 2 teenage girls. So this is my jam. Worrying about worrying is my constant state of being.
Yeah.
It's so I often find myself exactly that, like worrying about what's going to happen when they go out. And then I'll be sitting, well, why am I worrying about this? And I keep coming back to, is this a control issue with myself in trying to control in order to keep them safe? Or is it a trust issue? Am I not trusting them to make the right decision? So I'm curious if there is an element of that in this worrying.
The first thing that's wonderful. The first thing I'd like to say here, though, is I try to say this delicately.
Give it to me, Dr. Chris.
There's more than an element there, I think, of you beating yourself up. You've sort of accused yourself of being controlling and accused yourself of not trusting. All right. So before we address that, we might step just back a bit and to say that I think as I said, we're hardwired to worry. All right. And control is a very, very important goal. It's a very important factor in our living. We wouldn't have survived as a species if we couldn't get some sort of measure of control of the environment that's important to us, right? And the most important thing for human beings in the environment is other people, right? We're extraordinarily social species, and with our own kids, we have a vested interest. I mean, after all, they're carrying our genes into the next generations. So we want them to prosper and thrive. We're going to be hyper vigilant about their fortunes, and we come hardwired to have very strong altruistic feelings towards them, and even to sacrifice self towards it. So obsessed is not the right word, but we come very hardwired to be super, super, super concerned about their fortunes. Okay. And that's going to override issues like, do I trust them? Because you actually, what weighs more heavily into the algorithm is, I'm a mother. I've got to make sure they're safe and they prosper. Do you get that?
100%. And that's when you mentioned those feelings of safety, and that's exactly what it comes back to. And that's a fear-based, right? That they're not going to be safe. So that absolutely makes sense.
So now we've got that part of the answer out of the way. You can go a bit easier on yourself, and the reason is, the world we live in is so much incredibly safer than the world for which Homo sapiens were designed, right? And, the chances of catastrophe are so small. I mean, it happens, of course, and we read about it in the media. But generally, we can relax a lot more than our nervous system says we can, right? And as a general point, understanding that we're hardwired to worry more than is currently warranted can help us recognize it and relax a bit, right? There are other podcasts that would more address the issue of why you would criticize yourself for worrying so much about them. But, again, that's tied to the dynamics of esteem between human beings and how we want to make sure we're a good person so the village, values us, and so we'll survive and, pass on our genes. But that's a whole other topic, okay? But, I think relaxing around it a bit is very helpful. They'll be fine. You're obviously a very good person. they live probably in a middle class, upbringing, and they're well fed, and they're probably healthy and all that stuff, right?
All those things, absolutely, yeah. And it
Yeah.
sounds like very much a shift in mindset for myself, and like getting away from that waiting for the other shoe to drop constantly. But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. We'll talk about that another time, because we are, sort of wired to be constantly on alert for the other shoe to drop. Yeah. Cool. Yes, Chris, what's in that very fertile mind of yours?
So when I was watching this, I was thinking about the notion of a spectrum of worry and how people might fall at different points on the spectrum.
Yeah.
And the reason I was thinking about this is because I am generally not that much of a worrier. My wife is very much a worrier.
Yeah.
And one of the things that that also leads is perhaps I don't know if there's a question out of this. There might be. We'll see where we go. Is the notion of like, I'm also a much more risk-taking person, and she is a much more risk-adverse person. I just assume that those things are connected. But also, I guess, like, the one thing that I'm uncertain about is this like a difference in the way that we're assessing the consequences, or is it just a difference in the way that we are programmed to think about potentially threatening things?
Yeah, no, it's great, and I'm glad you raised this, because it leads to a couple of very important distinctions. So in psychology, one way of conceiving the field of psychology is to say it's got two main big chunks, two elements. One is what we might call general psychology, which is the way we're all the same. So I've been talking in this podcast about we're a worrying species, right? And another big branch of psychology is individual differences, i.e., the way we're different to each other. And so your question is straddling these two, and the obvious place to go here is the question of personality in terms of individual differences. So you have very different personality to your wife, right? And it's specifically, as it bears on this question of worrying, almost certainly your wife is going to score higher on, lower on a dimension of personality called emotional stability, or just stability, right? So she's going to have a more sensitive nervous system. As a kid, she probably would have cried a bit more and a bit longer, and be more easily startled, and just being more sensitive in her nervous system, right? So the people who are born that way just tend to worry more. And the other thing that you mentioned there pertains to another dimension of personality, which is called openness to experience. And I know you, and you would score very high on openness to experience, right? And also I know you, and you're going to be quite emotionally stable, right? So you combine those two things, you're going to be looking for new adventures and new ideas and new things all the time, and you're going to love it. Whereas your wife may not be quite so open to new experience, and she prefers to have things be consistent, stay the same, right? So she's going to have a different relationship. So it's like you have this overarching species-wide predilection to negativity, bias, and worry, but then it's very differently mediated by different individuals. Does that help?
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. As always, always take a breath when you're asking a question. I think, geez, am I going to be able to answer this one? And this also applies to you, Terry. What's in your evil genius?
Well, I think it comes down to, when your partner, your wife, takes on the emotion of your child. So your child gets somewhat bullied a bit, and then it becomes your wife takes on that emotion.
Yeah.
Then it becomes a conversation between the parents, and then it becomes this big issue, and everyone's stressed except me.
Yeah.
And then sure enough, it just sorts itself out in the next week.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder whether, amplifying the issue, and that kind of like become what we do, adds so much more stress and energy than what was really needed in the first place.
Yeah. So quite a few ways to take this observation, Terry. I mean, one is that we live in our minds, right? So as human beings, we suffer all kinds of terrible things. In fact, it reminds me of that quotation from Mark Twain. He said in his life he's experienced some, many terrible things, and he paused and then said, and some of them happened. So we entertain things that then we then worry about, right? We die 1,000 deaths, and sometimes we don't end up even actually dying, before we. And so that's part of it, Terry. And the other part is to your comment about, of course, what we think then also leads to action, which then has implications. And so our thinking could lead to action, which then amplifies things to worry about, right? So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And it's interesting, and I notice you said that you tend not to get so worried. You're sort of a little bit more of an objective observer, and that rings true of you. I know that's the way you operate. So it can be a curious thing to watch, and of course this happens a lot in the therapeutic situation. When you're watching people upset themselves, when you're watching how they're creating things to worry about, and one of the really tricky things to help people shift is that the actions then create a reality which is actually worrying. And, it takes us back to an earlier podcast about that people are then right to be worried. So they get locked because I'm right. And again, my advice there is, yes, you might be right, but is this focus here actually helpful? Is it constructive? And so you just look around the world at the moment. It's quite a polarized world in lots of ways, polarized within countries and between countries. But at the heart of it is this very deep drive to be right. And that just feeds straight into this tendency to be worriers, right? Because, if you've already got the predisposition to worry, you're going to look for things to worry about, and you'll find them. And if you don't find them, you'll create them. So what a species, eh? The good thing about that, though, is people like me will never be out of a job. I shouldn't have said that, should I? Anyway, I said it. So once again, guys, thank you. Wonderful questions, wonderful insights. And I, very much look forward to us getting together again for another podcast. So take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.